Owen Hughes and Brad Sitko are CEO and CIO, respectively, of a new company playing by a new set of biotech investment rules. It's called Zonal Royalty. And these two are collectively mastering the art of mitigating biotech investment risk while simultaneously expediting the path of a host of therapeutics to patients. I'm Matt Pillar. This is the Business of Biotech JP Morgan edition. We're here in the beautiful offices of the law firm of Alston and Bird, who we're partnering up with on this series, and we're very thankful for the space. If you have any biotech or life sciences legal needs, Alston and Bird is your firm. I want to start out by getting to know you guys a little bit, but before we get into the meat of you guys, and what collective expertise you bring to do this new sort of investment paradigm, I want to learn about that. So I want to start there. Originally, I was thinking, we'll just start by getting to know these guys, but let's start with sort of the fundamental layout of what royalty aggregation is. And then we'll get into your backgrounds and how you're uniquely suited to move into this business.
Sure thing. Well, first, thanks very much for the invitation. We certainly appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you for taking time out of a very busy week to join me.
Our pleasure. Our pleasure. Second is, if that introduction has not been trademarked, should I can take that? You can have it. That was the most elegant approach and description of Zona and what we're trying to do.
I wrote it out so that I would deliver it out.
Yeah. I appreciate it. Well, Brad is much more steeped in royalty finance than I am. So, Brad, why don't you give a sense of what we're doing?
Absolutely. So what we're doing is actually bringing forward for a payment to pay future at-risk cash flows from pharmaceutical products. And that could be where a partnership is in place. So say a biotech company is developing a drug and they partner with a big pharma. There's a contractual arrangement in place that usually has milestones, like when you achieve your next phase of clinical development and when you achieve your regulatory approval or filing, and then you have royalties. So a portion of future net sales of the drug. So that's all at risk, and takes time. And what we do is pull that forward to a bolus of capital today. And what that allows companies to do is be flexible and deploy that type of capital to a new project that they're working on. Maybe they have a proprietary program that they want to advance, or a platform that they want to take forward to the next stage and advance a program into IND. So what we're doing is kind of creating a novel form of financing that's not equity related. So instead of selling pieces of a specific company or shares of your overall company, you're limiting the economic dilution to just a single partnered program.
That's interesting. All right. So it's interesting, but it sounds a little bit complicated. And I'm curious about how well known this model is. Like, are you guys coming out of left field sometimes when you propose?
Royalty financing is somewhat similar to SPACs.
Okay.
In the sense that it was a four-letter word that had very adverse connotation.
Yeah.
Until really the last couple of years. So I would say is that when you're in a set of a board meeting and you're looking at all the financing options that are available to you as a company, royalty financing is probably at the bottom, historically speaking.
Mm-hmm.
Given what's happening in the public markets today and over the last several years, it's ascending the order. And it's probably right up there with equity, with debt actually being below that.
Yeah.
And so it's in vogue in the sense because of what Brad just said, which is you can isolate the dilution to a single product relative to an entire company. So if you believe that the company is worth the summation of its cash flows, the cash flows are divided by the fully diluted shares outstanding. You're selling equity and you're giving people parts of every single product that you're delivering. In a royalty monetization, you're isolating it to one particular program and you maintain your equity ownership across the entire spectrum of your pipeline in a royalty monetization, which is quite different. Now, if you think about biotech, it's somewhat similar to actually building a house in that it always takes more time and it always takes more money.
Yeah.
What that translates to is more dilution for equity shareholders. And what we're trying to provide management teams and their shareholders an ability to actually progress molecules without suffering the equity dilution that is consistent or inherent in drug development.
So, Owen, you have a unique background in that you've worked in finance, but also you've worked on the biotech side, so you've seen some of that firsthand. Tell us a little bit about that, and sort of give us give us your background in the context of how it set you up to start Zoma.
I feel like I didn't start Zoma. Zoma's been around since 1981. It started as
so you didn't. I mean, in 1981, you were like a toddler.
I was just a baby. Yes, that is true. But maybe a little history on the company, because I think that's important relative to where we are and then where Brad and I come in. So Zoma started in 1981. It actually went public in 1984. It's actually the longest tenured, publicly traded, quote unquote, biotech company.
Yeah.
So people know Zoma as an antibody discovery company. And over those ensuing probably 30 to 40 years, Zoma has touched hundreds of antibodies. Over the course of that time, the management team decided that they wanted to take some additional risk and try to get into clinical development so they could actually generate better returns for the shareholders over time. Unfortunately, the company was not very successful in that endeavor. But what they were very successful in is actually creating the CDRs, the sequences that actually make an antibody. Mm-hmm. That was their bread and butter. So there are a number of different assets, antibodies that were actually discovered by Zoma. One of the most prolific ones is a drug called Rituxan. Mm-hmm. It actually came from our BC and phage display technologies. So in 2017, after several setbacks, the company, frankly, was on the verge of bankruptcy. And the existing management team, namely our CFO, Tom Burns, and the existing CEO at that point in time, they contacted a number of different funds to see if they could actually work a different business model. And there's a fund here in San Francisco by the name of the Biotechnology Value Fund. It was instrumental in the development of a company called Ligand, which is a competitor to ours, but slightly bigger than we are. Mm-hmm. And they actually recapped the company in 2017 with some capital and set us on the process of creator. So we understand the trials and tribulations of drug development because we've lived it. Yeah. Not only personally, but the company as a whole, the culture of the company has lived and learned it. So they were on the verge of bankruptcy several times, and they sold different royalties at that point in time to various parties so they could continue on their clinical development path. And it wasn't until 2017 where Tom, our CFO, came to light. He's like, we should probably stop doing this. History would suggest that we're not very good at it. But what we are very good at is actually making these antibodies. So we started with a base of around 40 to 50 assets that came from our licenses. We went out and prosecuted the IP around those licenses and brought everything back, the royalties and milestones. That's actually what started Zoma. That's really important because to try to replicate our business model would probably take a decade or so. And today, very few people actually have the patience in this particular space, and then overall as an investment perspective, to wait 10 years for this type of investment to come to fruition. Yeah. So that's the history of the company. Yeah. And that's why I think it's really important to understand the kind of what we're doing, because we live it, we breathe it. People often ask Brad and I, what's the difference between investing and operating? We've done both. Yeah. And what we say is that actually they're very similar. More often than not, you walk home with your head between your tail, asking yourself, why am I doing this? Because they're both extremely, extremely difficult. And then, yeah. But with that said, our backgrounds are akin to both investing and operating, which is essentially what this business is. We're frankly maybe not really good at either. We kind of sit right in the middle. Okay. Right. So maybe, Brad, you can give them a little your background. Yeah. And I'll talk to them.
Absolutely. So I'm kind of 20 years grizzled in life sciences in different forms and factions. And I've touched royalties over that entire career from different angles. So started out early as a strategy consultant. Working with royalty funds is one of the things I was mandated on to find, assess, and value different types of future royalties that they could apply. Like as the space was developing, like what Owen had said earlier about financing of last resort to now financing a priority. That's where that evolution started. Then I was on Wall Street at an investment bank, MTS Health Partners, where I was doing mergers and acquisitions, equity capital raises, and most importantly, royalty monetization from the agented side. So helping companies or universities raise capital by bringing some of the payments, the future payments for those royalties forward. And it was really interesting in that because you got to see how the entire royalty universe worked, how people behaved, how they thought about things, how they structured, how their strengths and their weaknesses. It was kind of like seeing the chessboard and analyzing how each of the chess pieces could move across the board. And each has their unique place in the universe, and you've got to deploy them or use them at the right time. Went on to become an operator at a company called DNA Nexus, which was orchestrating a turnaround in a healthcare IT company. And then ended up as an investor at RTW Investments, a large biotech full life cycle investment fund, where I was leading the structured finance and alternatives practice. And I was doing non-dilutive capital solutions for companies. And so at each step along the way, you have to look at the royalty space in different ways and see what is something that we could provide with this asset class that's truly differentiated. And is there a better place for it in the market than where it was existing? Exists primarily for commercial products that had been launched, already had sales. It was very much credit-like.
And then,
Whereas what we're doing is a little bit different take, where we're looking at that same asset class and looking at it earlier, because we in this public company can benefit from being patient and having time. And in the meantime, we're creating a lot of value for the biotech ecosystem because we're providing a type of capital that's otherwise unavailable in their life cycle. So like this really interesting synergistic way.
yeah. I can see where this would be appealing to your point, sort of moving up the ranks. I've fielded in recent years, as you can imagine, a lot of requests and inquiries around creative sources of capital because that direct route has been a little bit dry, as we know. It occurs to me, this is just theoretically, it occurs to me that there's that the risk, the risk aspect still has to remain somewhere, right? Like the risk shifts. So where does the risk shift in this model?
Maybe shift in height. If you have to think about our business model, and we do have several competitors, but our competitors, generally speaking, are actually further up to the right, meaning they're actually later stage.
Mm-hmm.
So we're the only company that we're aware of that actually spans the entire drug development spectrum. We'll underwrite risk at a preclinical stage all the way up to a commercial stage.
Yeah.
And so the way we think about risk is not much different than actually what we learned in our CFA days, right? It's portfolio management. What we're trying to find is the efficient frontier. Is how much risk do we need to take in order to engender a return that's commensurate with that risk? And so we take the principles of finance and we apply it to drug development. And if you take equity-like risk for credit-like returns, I would suggest that's a pretty bad business model. And I wouldn't suggest that our competitors are doing that per se. What I would say is that as you go further and further right to more and more assets that are further de-risked, your returns will come down over time. So for us, just given where our balance sheet is relative to what our business model is that we tend to focus on the earlier stage assets.
Mm-hmm.
You will be wrong more often than you're right. But there's a difference between your batting average and your slugging percentage. You can bat 200, but have a slugging percentage of 600 and still make a significant amount of money.
Yeah.
And we look at any portfolio attribution analysis. Generally speaking, what you find is 2 or 3 things that power the returns of the overall portfolio. Whether it's a hedge fund, a private equity fund, a mutual fund, and a public perspective, there's 3 or 4 things, 3 or 4 investments that drive the overall returns. There's several investments that are kind of in the middle that are plus minus 25%. And the key is to try to limit the zeros. And if you can do that, you can generate pretty good IRRs over time. So where our focus is on essentially the asymmetric risk reward, where we don't have enough information to truly underwrite to a 50% probability of success. In our world, it's either 0 or 100%. The drug either work, it's not going to work.
Yeah.
So the way we think about risk is how much money are we willing to lose? And so many of our investments are staged in the sense that the total quantum of capital is relatively finite in the sense that we know exactly what it is. We don't put ourselves at risk for future payments down the road, generally speaking. And if we lose that investment, meaning we lose that money, it's not detrimental to the overall company because it's shielded by our overall portfolio. So our objective since we came here is trying to build a portfolio both in sheer size, but diversified across the actual risk spectrum, preclinical to commercial, diversified by the therapeutic indication, oncology, virology, immunology, etc. Divided by diversified by the stage, and then by the modality, small molecules, antibodies. We haven't ventured into the gene therapy space just quite yet. We're looking at a few things there, and that gets you total diversification. Because what we learned in the 2008, 2009 timeframe, when we were sitting on Wall Street, historically speaking, people have said that stocks and bonds and gold and real estate crypto maybe is not really correlated. But in 2008, 2009, we learned that it's the exact opposite, that all those asset classes are totally correlated. A correlation of one, everything went down. And so the interesting thing about our business model is that an oncology asset and a virology asset and an antibiotic, whatever it may be, are totally uncorrelated. Not only uncorrelated from a science perspective, they're uncorrelated from an economic perspective. Recessions, generally speaking, will not hit pharmaceutical product. It may dip slightly. Mm-hmm. So what we're developing is an asset class that's totally uncorrelated to the equity and credit markets, which should be very appealing to an ultimate investor.
Yeah.
And so with all that said, where we are in the gestation of our company is that we're just kind of getting out of the crib and just starting to crawl. And what, that makes sense?
It does. It does. But you're crawling around a lot of moving parts. I'm curious about the management approach, right? Like it's highly situational, a lot of moving parts, a lot of assets at different stages, across multiple modalities. I mean, is there a mechanism by which an algorithm, maybe some AI or machine learning, like what's the sexy sauce that allows you to, on a daily basis, make decisions around these assets and at least be aware, right, of the progress and where things are
I think it's probably better than any algorithm.
It's a black box.
It's the experience of the school of hard knocks.
Yeah.
Right. If you've been around the block long enough and seen enough things, you have an indication of what could be good and what may not be good. And so there's no compression algorithm for experience. So I think that the way we generally look at it is you've got to create that diversity. There are ebbs and flows in the sector. There are modalities that are really interesting today that a couple of years ago, no one would touch them. So there's pendulum swings all over the place. So I think the way we think about it is you keep that diversity and that lack of correlation as much as possible, with the focus on that long-term end goal, which for us is creating long-term sustainable cash flows at a significant rate and a ramping rate. And how you get there is, situation dependent. We talked to, we've been overwhelmed with JP Morgan this year, talking to companies who are trying to navigate the environment. So it's like, how do you, one, find something that we think is interesting, has potential, has the potential to go forward, a situation where we can be helpful and meaningful. Like we write checks that, are only applicable to certain sizes of companies or situations. So it's that combination of keeping track of what we have and what we've built with the portfolio versus every situation we see and can be added.
Yeah. Well, and I didn't get to your background and how it sort of feeds into your management at Xoma. So you give us a great, you mentioned experience. So, what's the algorithm? What's the black box? It's experience. Tell us about your experience leading up to your leadership at Xoma and how it sort of feeds into what Brad was just talking about. That, well, I don't know. the intuition.
What I would say is along scars in the back. Right, so I spent 16 years as an investor, initially investment banking, sales side research, but the majority of the time on the buy side. I worked for a private equity firm. I worked for a very large money manager, largest money manager in the world, and invested in biotech stocks, but also hospital stocks and PBMs and et cetera. So I had a pretty good view of just the overall healthcare ecosystem. And then in 2013, I left and I went to the operating side. I worked for a GLP-1 company before GLP-1s were in vogue.
Oh, wow.
I worked for a...
any regrets getting out of that space before it blew up?
No, I would say, so I grew up doing athletics. And I would say that you can't replicate what you have on the operating side. In the investment side, you generally operate in chiefdoms. There's a healthcare team and a finance team, a consumer team, et cetera. And you may work with 3 or 4 people, but you don't really interact with the other folks inside the firm. You certainly do from a social perspective, but not necessarily from a business perspective. And I would say there's nothing more rewarding than actually putting a drug into human and having it work.
Yeah.
And getting calls from families and actual patients to suggest that we've extended their lives years. So that's why I did it. And I'm certainly very happy that I made the decision. Every now and then, I'd like to go back to the investing route because, as I mentioned before, is investing in and operating are very similar. Every day there's an alarm fire. The question is it one alarm, 5 alarm? And more often than not, it's one alarm. But when it's five alarm in the operating side, it's much more difficult than it is on the investing side. The investing side, we just sell. We made a mistake and we sell.
Yeah, I was curious about that, like what the liquidity sort of factor looks like on the asset, right? And is there any catch when if and when you decide to offload an asset?
Mm-hmm.
Is it any more difficult given the model?
Yes, it's a static investment, right? It's either all or nothing.
Yeah,
generally speaking. On occasions, we'll invest in something, we'll make a mistake, and we'll actually get the asset back. But generally speaking, if the asset doesn't work, we write it off and we move on.
yeah,
So it goes back to my point about the batting percentage relative to the slugging percentage. We need to actually maximize the slugging percentage. The only way we can do that is have a batting average, enough opportunities, because we need to actually diminish the overall risk. The only way to diminish risk is you actually have to distribute that risk across a number of different investments. Does that make sense?
it does. Yeah.
So my background is in 16 years on the buy side, sell side, the last 13, 14 years on operating companies. Worked at a diabetes company. I started my own oncology company. It's publicly traded. I was the CEO for 5 years. I ran a nephrology company that we exited through a license agreement with a big pharma company. And I've worked at venture capital firms. I've worked at private equity firms. I've worked at mutual funds. And I've kind of seen the flow from an investment perspective. And at the same time, I've actually operated companies. I know what it takes to get a drug to the clinic and ultimately to commercialization. And I say that they're both unbelievably hard. And it goes back to what Brad was talking about in your question as it relates to risk. I'm pretty convinced at this point in time that when you look at assets in clinical data, you can rule things out. You can say fairly definitively, is like, I do not believe this drug is going to work. And generally, you're going to be right because that's what statistics suggest.
Genuinely going to be right. You're going to be right even if you, even whether or not
you may be right for the wrong reason.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, you're right because 90% of all drugs fail, plus or minus a couple percent here.
Yeah.
What's more difficult, however, is to rule something in.
Yeah.
To look at a piece of data and say, I know this drug is going to work because it may work mechanistically. The biology actually may work, but there's a human component to drug development, which is execution.
Mm-hmm.
And what you find is that most drugs that actually don't make it because of human execution. The people aspect is unbelievably important. In fact, it's more important than the actual science. I'm pretty convinced at this point in time.
Wow. Yeah.
And so when we do deals, generally speaking, much of what we do is actually already been partnered. And so we're underwriting to the risk of the company that's actually developing the drug, not the company that started with the drug, but the company that's actually currently executing it on the development time. And oftentimes that is a large pharma company or a very experienced, large or mid-cap biotech company. That's not to say that the risk diminishes, but what I have found is that smaller companies, of which I have been part of and unfortunately have participated in, is we cut corners because we don't have the capital to run the correct studies. And so we're trying to get to the end goal as quickly as possible, and we take risks. They're all calculated bets, whether it's the trial design, the including and excluding criteria, the geographic scope of the trial, whatever it may be. There's 100 variables. But inevitably, you're cutting some corners because you don't necessarily have the capital.
Yeah.
And so when we think about our business, we can't affect those things, right? We don't have enough capital to serve or address all the issues that happen in drug development. We don't have the skill sets. So that goes back to what I was talking before, is that we're really just finance individuals that have some domain knowledge in healthcare, perhaps biotech specifically. We're trying to provide the principles of financial and portfolio management to the actual biotech space.
Yeah.
Not only do we do it from an investment perspective, but we also do it just with our own company. And we can get into kind of how we finance the company and how we think about our shareholders. But I think the most important thing is at the end of the day, is this is an inherently risky business. It's probably the most risky business of anything out there today.
Mm-hmm.
And we're seeing that reflected in the public markets today because in the 2018, 19, 20 timeframe, when the cost of capital was zero, not only was the cost of capital zero, but people thought everything was going to work, right?
Yeah.
And that's just not the case today. We're on the downside of that, which actually to us is actually very beneficial because that's actually where we come in to provide capital to companies.
Mm-hmm.
But we have to be very judicious in the investments that we make and the people that we underwrite.